Happiness. The title of my speech is actually Happiness Can Be Contained Within a Plate of Food, or is contained within a plate of food. Now, some of you are probably thinking that this guy up the front here is slightly mad, or about to tell you that the chemicals and hormones contained within our food actually makes us happy. Now, I'm not altogether sure about the latter, but the first is most certainly true. I mean, after all, I carry a wooden spoon around, and it has my name plastered on it just in case I forget who I am. But that's neither what I want to talk about, nor what my speech actually refers to. In fact, I just want you to hold this little metaphoric morsel in the back of your minds, because I am going to actually return to it. Now, when I was young, or younger, my mother, she used to love going to the airport. And I always assumed this was because she got to look at planes landing and planes taking off, which for me was very exciting. But my mother actually liked going to the airport for a completely different reason altogether. For her, the arrivals hall was a place of immense happiness, because as far as she was concerned, this was a place where people who had obviously been separated by long distances and often many years would suddenly coalesce and get together again. So for my mother, that point, that moment, that communion of body again was a very important moment for her life, because that was what made her happy. Now, of course, while my mother was being happy greeting our visiting guests, I was, of course, busy staring at the planes. Now, as we, of course, would get home, my mother would have little caveats to add to all her little stories. And one of the caveats that she would obviously like to tell me was the following. She'd say, "Costa, my son," because that's how my mother spoke, of course. "Costa, my son, all guests," she would say to me, "after a few days, all guests begin to smell like fish." Now, you probably all figured out how long you can say "my mum's house," which isn't very long. Okay, but what she meant, what the message in this madness of hers was quite simple, actually, that happiness, the happiness of greeting those people at the airport, is actually a fleeting affair. It doesn't stay long with us. It sort of drifts and disappears and leaves us with its faint aromas. And the strange thing is that this is actually both natural and good. I mean, if you think about it, imagine a ball of gum which never lost its flavor. This would be a total aberration, because that first succulent kind of bite into that gum would lose all its value, because every bite, subsequent bite, would be exactly identical. And so, strangely enough, the boring bits, those bits between that first bite and that last kind of spitting out of the gum, are in essence essential for our understanding of happiness. And there are many examples to illustrate this point. I'll give you another one of mine. When I was in Italy, I read War and Peace. Yes, I read the entire book, cover to cover. And I loved it. It had great characters, it had sweeping dramas, it had great historical calamities, and I felt like I had achieved something significant by reading this book. And yet, unsurprisingly, it was stuffed with boring bits. Mostly Tolstoy waxing poetic about historical analyses, which were very boring and dry. And the same could be said about most every novel. I mean, I read Melville's Moby Dick as well. And that is stuffed with boring bits too, mostly about whaling and the manufacture of oil. Thrilling stuff, as you can see. However, I found ultimately that those boring bits were actually essential for my understanding of what it means to be happy. And so the first point really I want to make is that the boring bits, that vacuum of happiness, is where we become most alive to happiness, most aware of its existence and our need for it. But there's another little caveat. Just like my mother, I like to have caveats. And the thing is that it's not just the fact that boredom is essential to happiness, but actually, paradoxically enough, one of the things that we require is a skill to endure boredom. I think that this is a fundamental skill that we need to be taught, and we need to learn to endure boredom, because actually only through great effort, great perseverance through very boring bits, and all those IB students in the room will know this, you have to persevere through all those boring bits in order to succeed and get something at the end of it. So I think enduring boredom is also a fundamental skill. Now, there are many obstacles to happiness. There are many, and I can think of three off the top of my head, and here they are. The first one is what I call mental fatigue. We're constantly surrounded by noise. Okay, surrounded by the AC going off, you're surrounded by traffic noise, you're surrounded by your phones going off, by people's chatter. And even though a lot of it is in the back of our minds and it's subconscious, we are inevitably, our body is processing it, our mind is constantly processing it. So we end up being rather fatigued. Another thing is that we're constantly in the presence of strangers. I don't know half of you, for example. And so you're always trying to figure out, as natural human beings do, whether you're friend or foe. And so you're never in a state of rest or calm. And so again, you become fatigued by this experience. And then, of course, most, of course, symptomatic of our age. We're always in a hurry. We're always in a hurry to get somewhere, mostly to work. And so it's not surprising that by the time we get to work, we're mentally exhausted. And to spare our employers, actually, they're in the same boat as well, okay? So another obstacle I've actually discovered is this thing called self-importance. We have this idea, intrinsic idea, I would say, that everything we say and do is of significant importance. Our egos cannot let go of this idea that whatever I am saying now is very important, or whatever I'm about to do is of some global significance. And so we can't let go of things. We end up putting enormous amounts of pressure on ourselves because we amplify everything we're doing. This must be so important, I can't possibly do this. Even great calamities in our lives, you know, when somebody leaves you and you think, for example, that, oh my God, my life is ended. I will never be happy again. Okay, and then surprisingly, you somehow endure and manage to get through. Okay, but it's this importance that we place on things that obviously exhausts us and acts as an obstacle to happiness. And the last one, my favorite, is envy. We envy all sorts of things, actually mostly each other. Okay, we envy our successes, our accomplishments, how much money I have in the bank, what car I drive, how intelligent I am or not, Brandy Scott's shoes, okay, and on it goes. Okay. So these are the obstacles to happiness, and of course they're not exclusive, there are many others I'm sure, but the idea is that surprisingly, in a rather paradoxical way, the solution, the actual cure, if I can put my little Dr. Phil hat on, the cure to these is actually happiness itself. Because if you come to think of it, when you're happy, you can endure the noise of everyday living. When you're happy, not surprisingly, you can endure laughing at yourself, okay? And you do laugh at yourself often, so you don't feel this idea of self-importance. And most importantly of all, what is more enviable than happiness? And yet, where is this happiness? Where do we find this happiness? Now, a friend of mine who's actually in the audience once told me, Costa, because that's how my friend speaks to me, she said, Costa, happiness lies in the small pleasures in life, she said to me once. By which she meant those sort of common, background, uncommented aspects of our lives that we all more or less experience, those ordinary moments. And there are so many of them. Allow me to illustrate with some of my own little examples. When I was younger, I was at a friend's house and we were sitting in his room talking like youths do about, unimportant things, when his mother glides into the room. And she walks over to his bookshelf and she takes the sake bottle that I had bought him from my time in Japan. She puts it under her arm, under her shoulder, and she proceeds to glide back out. Now, of course, my friend sitting there, rather stunned, he says to her, Mum, Costa gave that to me. It's mine. And of course, he put a lot of emphasis on the fact that I gave it to him. To which his mother says, Humph, in her imperial Italo-Italian accent, she says, Salvat, I gave you life. And she storms out. Now, you got to love mothers, right? There's a lot of mothers in my stories. Now, inevitably, of course, we just ended up bursting in laughter. And every time, of course, I see sake bottles or somebody says something about it involves sake, I can't but laugh because that is the moment that comes to mind. Now, I have another friend who was visiting, and we were standing outside Jumeirah Mosque, taking photos. And suddenly she gets very excited. And she goes, oh my God, look, she says, you too in Dubai have a suburb called Beijing. So every time now I see signs that say begin, of course I can't but smile. And so there are so many. I mean, sitting in front of the television, having breakfast, for example, or watching the sun put on its light show, particularly in the evenings. It can't but bring a smile to your face. And these are the small pleasures in life. And the thing that's beautiful about them is these two things, I would say, that they're so ordinary. They're the ordinary things of everyday life. And fundamentally, they're often shared. They're often shared between people, or they're shared in common. We all have them. And this is something I want to stress a little bit. Now, the axis of being, I would say, who we are. We discover ourselves through other people, actually. And so the axis of being, who we are, actually is that sense of belonging. Belonging to something greater than myself. And it's quite simple that you end up thinking, it's not hard to believe that that you can love somebody. That's pretty straightforward. Loving somebody is the most natural thing. But it is a bit strange that somebody loves you, actually, if you come to think of it. You think, with my imperfections, with my inner ugliness, with all my flaws, how can somebody possibly love this? And yet, somebody does. And so it begins. You go home one day, And there is a plate of food for you. I've come back to the plate of food. That plate of food is for you. You go to work one day, and a colleague of yours turns to you with a smile. And so it begins. You can only turn to these people with a sense of gratitude. And these are the small, ordinary, and shared pleasures in life. Now, a favorite author of mine, Stephen Fry, he once damned our generation, and he said, this is a generation of the instant and the infantile, he said, by which he meant that we want things now, instantly, and we want them in bite-sized pieces, easy to understand. But the same thing applies to happiness, if you come to think of it, because we want happiness to be now, and we want it all the time, and we want it easily accessible, within reach. And the way we do this is very straightforward. We pursue consumerism, we pursue consumer items. We surround ourselves with stuff, because we believe that stuff is going to actually make us happy. What I would propose, if I have to put my TOC hat on, that's theory of knowledge for those of you who don't know. If I had to put my TOC on, I would say what we need is a paradigm shift. We need to take off these glasses through which we see the world, or happiness I should say, as a pursuit of consumerism, and instead start looking at the simple pleasures in life, those small pleasures my friend referred to. Now, I'm coming back to my mother. My mother came from this village. It's actually called Water Nymph, by the way. Never mind. She came from this village, and her entire education was pretty much summed up in Proverbs. She never went to high school, of course, so everything she learned was through Proverbs. So she would often repeat these to me. Costa, my son, she would say. One of her favorite Proverbs was this one. She goes, bean by bean, the sack becomes full. It took me a while to figure out what my mother was referring to. She was referring to money, of course. Penny for penny, eventually your bag becomes full, and you have a bag full of money, basically. But the same thing, actually, paradoxically enough, can be applied to happiness. Because if you think about it, bean by bean, we amass our small pleasures, and we all have them, those ordinary, common pleasures in life, so that in the end, we can sow our own little garden of happiness. Thank you very much.